Have you ever had a motion sensor that turns the lights off the second you sit still? That was my living room. I'd be on the couch watching TV and the Christmas tree would just click off. As far as a normal PIR sensor is concerned, if you're not moving enough, you're not there. So in this video, I'm going to show you the mmWave presence sensor I built to fix that. On screen here, you can see Home Assistant showing LD204050 presence detected. And as soon as that flips on, it powers my smart plug and turns the tree light on. When the room is empty for 5 minutes, it turns them off again. It's also really nice for those nights where we forget to turn the tree off before going to bed. Home Assistant just takes care of it once the room's empty. And the big difference is that this sensor keeps the lights on even when you're sitting perfectly still. In this project, I'm using an HLK LD204050 mmWave presence sensor with an ESP32C3 Super Mini and a small BMP280 sensor, all inside a 3D printed enclosure in my living room. I'll walk through how it works, the parts I used, how it hooks into Home Assistant, and a few mistakes I made along the way so you don't have to blow up your own sensors. Quick refresher, what's different about mmWave compared to a basic PIR? A PIR sensor just looks for changes in infrared heat. You move, it sees a change, it triggers. You stop moving, and after a while it assumes the room is empty. A mmWave sensor like the LD204050 is basically a tiny radar. It sends out radio waves and listens for the reflections. That lets it pick up very small movements, like you shifting slightly on the couch or even subtle body motion. Some mmWave sensors can go even further and detect things like breathing patterns and heart rate, because they're so sensitive to tiny changes. I'm not using those features here, but it gives you an idea of how capable this tech is. For this project, that sensitivity means it can detect still targets, so you sitting on the couch still counts as presence, see moving targets separately, and give you a target count. In Home Assistant, you can see all of that. Moving target, still target, counts, and an overall presence sensor. For this build, I'm just using the simple presence detected, not detected binary sensor. That's why I didn't just throw in another PIR. I wanted something that would keep the room occupied, even when people are just relaxing and not really moving much. One other thing worth mentioning, this gives you a lot of the benefits of smart presence detection without adding another camera to the room. There's no video stream, no microphone, it's just looking at movement and presence using radio waves. So it's nice for spots like living rooms and bedrooms where you want the lights and automations to be smart, but you're not super keen on putting a camera on the wall. Hardware-wise, this one's pretty simple. I've got the HLK LD204050 radar module. That's doing all the presence detection and it talks over UART. An ESP32C3 Super Mini from AliExpress. That's the brain. Tiny, cheap, built-in USB and it runs ESPHome nicely. A BMP280 for temperature and pressure. I originally had a BME sensor in there, but I accidentally fed it 5 volts instead of 3.3, so that one is cooked. And it's all powered over USB, always on. No battery to worry about for this build. All of that lives in a 3D printed enclosure that I've mounted near the TV in the living room. You don't need this exact enclosure though. If you don't have a 3D printer, you could leave the boards on a small PCB stand or throw them in an off-the-shelf plastic box and just cut a little window or opening for the radar to see out of. I put the STLs for my enclosure and a wiring diagram on the blog if you do want to copy this version. In terms of parts, everything here is easy to get. The LD204050 and the ESP32C3 Super Mini are both fairly affordable and you can find them on places like AliExpress and the usual electronic suppliers. The nice thing with the radar is that it still works fine inside a plastic enclosure like this. As long as you're not using metal and the walls aren't ridiculously thick, it can see straight through it. Price-wise, building this yourself works out way cheaper than buying a ready-made presence sensor. For this build, the parts came in at about $6.60 for the mmWave sensor, $4 for the ESP32C3, $3.90 for 5 BMP280s, and that part's optional, and around $2.20 for a small plastic enclosure if you're not 3D printing your own. Even if you include the BMP280 and buy an enclosure, you're in the ballpark of $15 of hardware for the core setup. On the other hand, if you really don't want to touch a soldering iron, you can just buy a ready-made mmWave sensor instead. You'll just pay for the convenience. The Aqara Presence Sensor FP2 is around $197. It does work with Home Assistant, but you have to set it up through the Aqara app and an Aqara account first before you can bring it into Home Assistant. There are also no-name mmWave presence sensors on Amazon at around $61, but the one I was looking at only had about 2.9 out of 5 stars, so it's a bit of a gamble. So for me, spending around $15 on parts, flashing ESPHome and dropping it straight into Home Assistant makes a lot more sense than paying $200 for a box sensor I can't really tweak. If you're even slightly comfortable with basic wiring, it's a nice little project that saves you a lot of money and gives you full control over how it behaves. Wiring is fairly straightforward, but I still managed to trip over a few things. The LD204050 uses UART, so transmit on the radar goes to receive on the ESP32, receive on the radar goes to transmit on the ESP32, and it needs 5 volts and ground. The BMP280 is on I2C and it runs on 3.3 volts, so that's 3.3 volts and ground plus SDA and SCL back to the Super Mini. Where I went wrong, in my ESPHome config, I originally set GPIO 7 and 8 as the I2C pins instead of 8 and 9, so the sensor obviously wasn't showing up. Then I managed to plug ground into the wrong pin on the radar, which led to a nice little debugging session where nothing worked and it was entirely my fault. And like I mentioned before, that first BME sensor was wired up to 5 volts instead of 3.3, which is a great way to permanently warm it up. So the takeaway is pretty simple. Double check the pinout for the ESP32C3 Super Mini, double check the pinout for each sensor, and make sure your ESPHome pins match how you've actually wired it. I have a clean wiring diagram in the blog post to save you from repeating those mistakes. On the firmware side, this is all ESPHome. In the YAML, I've set up the UART bus for the LD204050, added the LD204050 component which exposes presence, moving target state and count, still target state and count, and total target count, and then added the BMP280 over I2C for pressure and temperature. You can see all those sensors here in Home Assistant. I'm not going to go deep into UART commands or advanced tuning in this video. There are some really good docs for the LD204050 itself and for the ESPHome integration that walk through the setup and all the options if you want to tweak zones, distances, and so on. For this project, the main ones I care about are LD204050 presence, detected or not detected, and occasionally the target counts when I'm testing. The temperature from the BMP is honestly more of a lesson than a useful sensor. Because it's inside the enclosure with the ESP and the radar, it reads about 5 degrees hotter than my proper indoor sensor next to it. So if I rebuilt this, I'd probably skip the temp sensor in this enclosure or mount a dedicated room sensor somewhere more exposed to the air. The automation for the Christmas tree is really simple. When presence is detected, turn on the smart plug for the tree. When presence has not been detected for 5 minutes, turn it off. That means the tree comes on automatically when someone walks into the living room, it stays on while you're on the couch, even if you're not moving much, and if everyone goes to bed and forgets to touch anything, it turns itself off a few minutes after the room is empty. It's been solid, and we haven't had the tree randomly turning off mid-movie since. You can obviously take this a lot further than just the Christmas tree. A few ideas include dimming or turning off the living room lights if there's no presence for a while at nighttime, pausing media or turning off the TV when the room is empty, or tying it into an away or night mode so the behavior changes once everyone's gone to bed. In my case, I'm also thinking about adding a second sensor in the kitchen. My living room and kitchen are basically one open space, and right now the sensor doesn't really see me when I'm in the kitchen. Once I'm back within that roughly 6 meter zone, it works great. But with a second sensor, I could have the tree turn on from either side of the room. After I'd mounted everything, I also connected the radar to the HLK app to have a look at the visualizer. You get this little map view where it shows targets moving around in front of the sensor. It's a nice way to confirm that it's actually detecting you in the spots you care about. Check how far out it can reliably see, and make sure the enclosure or mounting angle isn't blocking anything. I basically use this as a quick sanity check with the sensor in its final location, and once I was happy with that, I just let ESPHome and Home Assistant handle the rest. In day-to-day use, it's been pretty well behaved. I haven't really had any random false triggers. The only time I've seen it fire when no one was in the room was when I left the fan running. So if you've got ceiling fans or pedestal fans in the sensor's field of view, that's something to keep in mind. My living room and kitchen are in the same open plan area, and like I mentioned, once I'm within that roughly 6 meter zone in front of the sensor, it works really well. When I'm right over in the kitchen, it generally doesn't pick me up, which is why I'm planning to add that second sensor in the kitchen and have the automations trigger off either one. Placement wise, the docs suggest mounting it around chest height for best results. Mine's actually much lower, more like knee height near the TV unit, and I haven't had any real issues with detection from the couch. So there is a bit of flexibility there, but if you're installing one from scratch, I'd still aim closer to chest height if you can. There are a few things I'd tweak for version 2. First, the enclosure. I'd like to shrink it down a bit and redesign the internal mounting so the boards sit more cleanly. And I'm not really a fan of the lid. It doesn't stay on that well, and it makes the whole unit sit a bit weird. If it was wall mounted, it'd probably be fine, but next time I'd add some kind of internal lid or frame so everything locks in more securely. Second, the temperature sensor. Having it buried in the same box as warm electronics isn't ideal, so either I'd move that out or just remove it from this project entirely. And then on the software side, I'd like to experiment more with using still versus moving targets differently, maybe different automations at night versus during the day, or using target counts to tell the difference between one person and a group. But even in this first version, it does exactly what I wanted. It keeps the room occupied where people are actually there, and it quietly turns things off when they're not. If you're looking at this and thinking, yeah, but I don't have a 3D printer, that's completely fine. You can run the boards on a little prototype stand, mount them in a cheap plastic junction box, or hide them on top of a shelf as long as the radar has a clear view of the room. So that's the mmWave presence sensor that's currently running our Christmas tree in the living room. If you want to build your own, I'll leave a link below to a blog post with the full ESPHome YAML, wiring diagrams, and the STL files for this enclosure if you want to print it. If you've got ideas for a V2, different automations, other rooms this would be handy in, extra sensors, let me know in the comments, because I'd like to keep iterating on this. If you found this useful, feel free to like the video, and if you want more DIY smart home projects like this, consider subscribing.